Ellie Simmons, a young accountant eager to prove herself, uncovers a devastating secret. Her charming, successful boss, Richard Jackson, is stealing from his employees and hiding millions in offshore accounts. Driven by anger and desperation, especially with her mother's life hanging in the balance, Ellie risks everything to expose his corruption. Her meticulous plan leads to Richard's public downfall, but as the dust settles, Ellie discovers the true cost of revenge. With her life unraveling and her greatest fight ending in heartbreak, she's left to question if justice was truly worth the sacrifice. This gripping tale of betrayal, vengeance, and unexpected tragedy explores the fine line between retribution and self-destruction. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above me as I walked into the sleek, glass-paneled office of Jackson and Company for the first time. My heels clicked nervously against the polished floors, echoing in the quiet morning air. This was supposed to be the start of my dream, my first real job, a fresh college graduate with a shiny accounting degree. The receptionist, a petite woman with a tight bun and a weary smile, greeted me and handed me a visitor's badge. "You're the new hire, right?" "Ellie Simmons?" she asked, her voice kind but distracted. "That's me," I replied, clutching my bag a little tighter. I glanced around at the pristine office space, at the sleek black desks and framed certificates that screamed success. My heart thudded with nervous anticipation. "Richard will see you shortly," she added, before returning to her computer. I nodded, not knowing yet that those words would take on a whole different meaning in the months to come. Richard Jackson, the man behind the empire, had been something of a legend in my field, a self-made entrepreneur, charismatic, and ruthless. To me, he was a symbol of success. The first meeting was nothing like I'd imagined. Richard greeted me with a firm handshake and a grin that made me feel instantly at ease. He was in his late 40s, with salt and pepper hair and a confidence that could fill any room. His tailored suit and Rolex screamed wealth, but his warm tone made him seem approachable. "Ellie. Welcome to the team," he said as if he'd known me for years. "We're lucky to have someone with your skills on board. I know you'll do great things here." I beamed, soaking in the praise. It felt good to be seen, to have my potential recognized. The first few weeks were a blur of training sessions, meetings, and endless spreadsheets. I worked hard, eager to prove myself, often staying late to double-check my work. My co-workers were friendly enough, though there was a palpable tension in the air that I couldn't quite place. Everyone seemed overly cautious, careful with their words, like they were walking on eggshells. At the time, I chalked it up to the natural stress of working in a fast-paced firm. Then my first paycheck arrived. I had been so excited to see the money hit my account, ready to celebrate the fruits of my labor. But when I checked the deposit, my stomach dropped. It was $200 short. Confused, I double-checked the stub, but there was no explanation for the deduction. Thinking it was just a mistake, I brought it up to HR. The HR manager, a wiry man named Steve, seemed nervous as he flipped through my paperwork. "Ah, yes," he said finally, clearing his throat. "That's part of the probationary deduction. Standard company policy." "Probationary deduction?" I asked, frowning. "That wasn't in the contract I signed." Steve gave me an apologetic smile. "It's, sort of an unofficial policy. Mr. Jackson likes to ensure new hires are fully committed before they earn their full salary." I felt a pang of irritation but forced myself to stay calm. It was my first job, and I didn't want to make waves. I thanked Steve and returned to my desk, trying to let it go. But as the months went on, the deductions didn't stop. Bonuses were promised and never paid. Overtime hours mysteriously vanished from the records. Every time I brought it up, I got the same dismissive answer: "It's just company policy." The final straw came when I overheard two senior employees whispering in the break room. "Did you hear about Monica?" one of them said. "She quit last week because Richard docked her entire bonus. Said the company couldn't afford it." The other employee scoffed. Meanwhile, he's driving a brand new Tesla and taking vacations in Dubai. The man's a crook. My chest tightened as the pieces began to click into place. It wasn't just me. Richard was stealing from all of us, using bogus policies and excuses to line his own pockets. I wanted to confront him right then and there, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Richard was untouchable, he owned the company, the rules, and everyone who worked here. Still, I tried. A week later, I found myself standing in his office, clutching a printout of my pay stubs. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, swirling a glass of scotch as I explained the discrepancies. His expression remained calm, almost amused. "Ellie," he said finally, setting the glass down. "You're a bright girl, but you need to understand how the world works. This isn't a charity. If you're not happy with the arrangement, you're free to leave. But I doubt you'll find another firm willing to take on someone with as little experience as you." My throat tightened with anger and humiliation, but I didn't let it show. I nodded politely, thanked him for his time, and walked out of the office with my head held high. Inside, though, I was seething. Things only got worse after that. The deductions continued, and my co-workers began to open up about their own experiences. One had lost thousands in unpaid commissions. Another had been forced to cancel his wedding after Richard slashed his bonus. It was clear now, Richard was a predator, preying on our desperation. Then, the unthinkable happened. My mom, my rock and the reason I worked so hard, fell seriously ill. The doctor said she needed surgery, immediately, and the cost was astronomical. My savings wouldn't cover it, not even close. Swallowing my pride, I went to Richard one last time. "An advance?" he repeated, raising an eyebrow as he leaned back in his chair. "Ellie, I don't think you understand how tight our budget is right now. I'm not running a charity." The words hit me like a slap. My face burned with humiliation, but Richard wasn't done. "You should have planned better," he added with a shrug, turning back to his computer as if I were a fly he'd swatted away. That was the moment something in me snapped. As I walked out of his office, I made a silent promise to myself. I wasn't going to let Richard get away with this, not with the stolen money, the ruined lives, or the smug, untouchable look on his face. I didn't know how I was going to do it yet, but I was going to bring him down. And when I did, he'd regret ever underestimating me. The weeks after Richard's dismissal of my request for an advance were some of the hardest of my life. Every night, I sat at my tiny kitchen table, staring at my mom's growing stack of medical bills. My paychecks barely covered rent and groceries, let alone the surgery she needed. She tried to put on a brave face, saying she'd figure something out, but I could see the fear in her eyes. It made my blood boil. Richard had more money than he knew what to do with, money he'd stolen from me and dozens of others, and he couldn't spare a cent to help someone in need. The anger simmered inside me like a fire I couldn't extinguish. I started staying late at the office, telling myself it was to catch up on work, but the truth was, I had a plan. It was risky, maybe even dangerous, but I couldn't let Richard get away with this. I began by familiarizing myself with the company's financial systems. As an accountant, I already had access to a lot of sensitive data, payroll records, expense reports, profit margins. But I needed more. I needed to get behind the polished numbers Richard presented to the world and find the hidden skeletons. It didn't take long for me to notice that something didn't add up. The first red flag came when I reviewed the company's expense reports. There were vague entries listed as consulting fees and marketing expenses, each for tens of thousands of dollars. But when I cross-referenced them with actual invoices, there was nothing to match. At first, I thought it was just sloppy record-keeping, but the more I dug, the clearer it became, Richard was funneling money somewhere off the books. I knew I had to tread carefully. If Richard or anyone else caught wind of what I was doing, I'd lose my job, or worse. So I worked in secret, waiting until everyone else had gone home for the night before combing through files and making copies. I started keeping a binder of evidence at home, hidden under my mattress. The breakthrough came one Friday night when I stumbled upon a file titled Overhead Costs, Miscellaneous. It was buried deep in the system, protected by multiple layers of passwords, but once I cracked it, my jaw dropped. It was a ledger of transactions, each one labeled with a code I didn't recognize. After hours of research, I realized the codes corresponded to offshore accounts. Richard wasn't just skimming from payroll, he was embezzling millions and hiding it in tax havens overseas. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the screen. I'd suspected Richard was corrupt, but this was bigger than I'd ever imagined. If I could prove this, I wouldn't just get back the money he'd stolen from me, I could destroy his entire empire. But I couldn't do it alone. The next day, I reached out to Lisa, a former employee who had quit the company after Richard refused to pay her commission. We weren't particularly close, but I remembered her as someone who wasn't afraid to speak her mind. I figured if anyone would be willing to help, it was her. When I called her, she was hesitant at first. "Ellie, I don't know," she said. "Richard's got powerful friends. People who'll protect him no matter what." "I get that," I replied, my voice steady. "But he's not just stealing from us, he's breaking the law. I found proof. Real proof. If we work together, we can take him down." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Lisa sighed. "All right. Let's meet and talk." We met at a coffee shop that evening, sitting in a quiet corner where no one could overhear us. I showed her some of the documents I'd copied, explaining what I'd found and how I planned to expose Richard. Her eyes widened as she flipped through the pages. "This is insane," she said, shaking her head. "I always knew he was shady, but this. Offshore accounts. Tax fraud. This could put him in prison." "That's the goal," I said firmly. Lisa agreed to help, and over the next few weeks, we worked together to build the case. She reached out to other former employees, gathering their stories and pay stubs as evidence. One by one, people began coming forward, workers who'd been cheated out of bonuses, interns who'd been forced to work unpaid overtime, contractors who'd never received their full payments. Each story painted a picture of a man who thought he was above the law, untouchable. The more we uncovered, the more determined I became. But I knew we couldn't just hand this over to the authorities and hope for the best. Richard had connections, judges, politicians, people who could make this whole thing disappear if they wanted to. We needed to go public, to make sure the world saw him for who he really was. That's when I decided to contact a journalist. Her name was Karen Blake, an investigative reporter for a local news outlet known for exposing corruption. I'd read some of her work before, stories about corrupt CEOs and shady business deals, and I knew she was the real deal. I sent her an anonymous email, attaching some of the evidence we'd gathered and asking if she'd be willing to meet. Karen responded within hours. "This is big," she wrote. "Let's talk." We met late one night in a diner on the edge of town. I was nervous as I slid into the booth, clutching the binder of evidence like it was my lifeline. Karen was already there, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Ellie, right?" she said, offering me a firm handshake. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Yeah. Thanks for meeting me." "Of course. Let's see what you've got." As I laid out the documents, Karen's expression shifted from curiosity to shock. "This is incredible," she said, flipping through the pages. "If this checks out, it's not just payroll theft. This is full-blown embezzlement. Tax evasion. He could go to prison for years." "That's the plan," I said quietly. Karen spent hours asking me questions, going over every detail of the evidence. By the time we finished, it was nearly midnight. "All right," she said, closing the binder. "I'll start digging into this on my end. But if we're going to run this story, I need to know you're ready for the fallout. Richard's not going to go down without a fight. I'm ready, I said, though the knot in my stomach told me otherwise. I didn't have a choice, not anymore. As I left the diner that night, I felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. For the first time in months, I felt like I had power, like I wasn't just another victim of Richard's greed. I didn't know how this would end, but I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't backing down. The Monday morning after my meeting with Karen Blake started like any other. The office hummed with the usual rhythm, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, and coffee machines sputtering out their caffeinated lifeblood. But beneath the surface, I was a live wire, buzzing with tension. Karen had told me it would take at least a week for her to verify the evidence and start drafting the story. Until then, I had to act normal, blending into the routine chaos of Jackson and Company, as though I wasn't holding a ticking time bomb in my hands. Richard, oblivious as always, strutted around the office in one of his expensive suits, barking orders at people and grinning like he owned the world. For a moment, I felt a pang of doubt. What if Karen couldn't find enough to go on? What if Richard found out what I was doing before the story broke? He wasn't just ruthless, he was connected. One wrong move, and he could crush me like an ant. But then I thought about my mom. About the fear in her eyes when the doctor explained how much her surgery would cost. About the co-workers who had been robbed blind by Richard and were too afraid to fight back. My fear turned into resolve. Richard deserved what was coming to him. That week crawled by like molasses. Every evening, Karen sent me updates, questions about specific documents, requests for clarification, but she didn't give much away about how the story was progressing. Trust the process, she kept saying, but patience had never been my strong suit. I was constantly on edge, jumping every time my phone buzzed or someone glanced in my direction for a little too long. Then, on Thursday afternoon, something happened that nearly derailed everything. I was at my desk, reviewing a client's account, when Richard's booming voice cut through the office. "Ellie. My office, now." Heads turned as I froze in my chair, my stomach dropping. My hands shook as I grabbed a notebook and followed him, trying to maintain a neutral expression. Did he know? Had someone tipped him off? Richard's office was a monument to excess: mahogany furniture, a liquor cabinet stocked with top-shelf whiskey, and a massive window overlooking the city skyline. He closed the door behind me and gestured for me to sit. I obeyed, clutching my notebook so tightly my knuckles turned white. "I've been hearing some interesting things about you," he began, leaning back in his chair and folding his hands over his chest. His expression was calm, but his eyes had a predatory gleam. "What do you mean?" I asked, forcing my voice to remain steady. "There's been talk that you've been asking a lot of questions. Digging into things that don't concern you." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Now, I appreciate ambition, Ellie, but I'd hate for you to lose focus on your actual job." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. He didn't know. Not yet. This was a warning, a veiled threat meant to put me back in line. "I'm just trying to do my job as thoroughly as possible," I said, keeping my tone polite but firm. "If there's something I've done to upset you, I apologize." Richard's smirk widened. "Good. I'd hate to see someone as talented as you waste their potential." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "But remember, Ellie, loyalty is everything in this business. Step out of line, and it's not just your job that's at risk." The implication was clear, and it took everything in me not to flinch. I nodded, muttered something about understanding, and practically sprinted out of his office. Back at my desk, I tried to focus, but my mind was racing. Richard was suspicious. I needed to move faster. The next day, Karen called me. "It's time," she said. "The story goes live on Monday. I've got everything I need: tax records, employee testimonies, offshore account transfers. Once this hits, he's finished." Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. How do we keep him from covering his tracks before the authorities step in? Don't worry, Karen said. I've already tipped off the IRS and a few legal watchdog organizations. They'll be watching closely. Once the story breaks, he won't have time to hide anything. That weekend felt like the calm before a storm. I stayed home, double-checking my binder of evidence in case anyone tried to discredit the story. I couldn't stop imagining Richard's face when he saw the article. Would he deny everything? Would he try to blame someone else? Part of me hoped he'd be hauled out of the office in handcuffs. It felt like poetic justice. When Monday finally arrived, I could barely keep my composure. The morning started as usual, but by 10 a.m., everything changed. It began with whispers, hushed conversations near the coffee machine, people scrolling through their phones with wide eyes. Then someone gasped audibly. "Oh my God! Did you see this?" a junior associate said, her voice trembling. She was holding up her phone, the screen displaying the headline in bold black letters. CEO Richard Jackson accused of embezzlement, tax fraud, and employee exploitation. Beneath the headline was Karen's article, complete with quotes from former employees, screenshots of the offshore account transactions, and a detailed breakdown of Richard's schemes. The story was everywhere: Twitter, LinkedIn, even the local news station. My co-workers looked at each other, stunned, as the weight of the revelation sank in. The door to Richard's office slammed open, and he stormed out, his face flushed with rage. "Everyone back to work," he barked, but his voice lacked its usual authority. He disappeared down the hallway, presumably to call his lawyers, but the damage was done. The office was abuzz with whispers, people passing around their phones and sharing their own stories of how Richard had wronged them. By noon, the media had descended on the building. Reporters camped outside, cameras pointed at the entrance, waiting for a glimpse of the man whose empire was crumbling before their eyes. Inside, the tension was palpable. HR was in chaos, fielding calls from current and former employees demanding their stolen wages. A few brave souls began packing up their desks, clearly ready to jump ship before things got worse. But the best moment came just after lunch. A black sedan pulled up to the front of the building, and two men in dark suits stepped out. They moved with purpose, their badges flashing as they pushed past the reporters and entered the office. The IRS had arrived. From my desk, I could see them walking straight toward Richard's office. For a moment, the office was silent, everyone holding their breath as they waited to see what would happen. Then came the sound of raised voices. Richard's booming tone, angry, defensive, was muffled by the walls, but it wasn't hard to imagine the conversation. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" I imagined him shouting, his face red, sweat beading on his forehead. "This is ridiculous. You'll hear from my lawyers." It didn't matter. Minutes later, the men emerged with Richard between them. He wasn't handcuffed, but the look on his face was enough to send a ripple of satisfaction through the office. His usual cocky demeanor was gone, replaced by a pale, panicked expression. He glanced around the room, his eyes narrowing as if trying to figure out who had betrayed him. I made sure to keep my face buried in my work, though my heart was racing with adrenaline. As the agents escorted him out, someone whispered, "Is he being arrested?" "No, just questioned," another replied. "For now." But we all knew what this meant. Richard Jackson wasn't invincible anymore. The moment the doors closed behind him, the office erupted into chaos. Some people cheered quietly, others whispered frantically about what might happen next. I stayed at my desk, trying to stay inconspicuous, but inside, I was bursting with pride. Months of work, sleepless nights, and endless fear had finally paid off. The mighty Richard Jackson had been exposed. By the end of the day, an official email was sent out from HR. Richard was stepping down, temporarily, to deal with the allegations, but we all knew what that meant. He wasn't coming back. The company's board of directors was scrambling to control the fallout, but the damage was already done. Clients were pulling out, lawsuits were being filed, and employees were quitting in droves. That night, I met Lisa at the same coffee shop where we'd first hatched our plan. She was grinning ear to ear, holding up her phone to show me the latest headlines. "They're saying he might face up to 10 years if the charges stick," she said, unable to contain her excitement. "It's not enough," I replied, though I couldn't help but smile. "But it's a start." We ordered coffee and toasted to our victory. It wasn't just about getting justice for ourselves, it was about proving that even the most powerful people could be held accountable. As I walked home that night, I felt lighter than I had in months. The battle wasn't over, there would be investigations, court hearings, and countless other hurdles to overcome, but for the first time, I felt like I was in control. Richard Jackson had spent years exploiting others, thinking he was untouchable. Now, the world knew the truth. And I had been the one to make it happen. The days after Richard's public downfall were a whirlwind of emotions. News outlets continued to cover the story, digging deeper into his history of fraud and abuse. Former employees came forward in droves, each one adding another nail to his coffin. Lawsuits piled up. The company's stock plummeted. It felt like justice was finally being served. My mom, who had been following the news obsessively, couldn't hide her pride when I told her the part I'd played. "You're so brave, Ellie," she said, her voice full of admiration. She looked frail sitting in her hospital bed, the surgery looming just a few weeks away. "You've always been my fighter." I smiled, but there was a weight on my shoulders that I couldn't shake. Karen's story had sparked a media firestorm, but the fallout wasn't as clean-cut as I'd hoped. While Richard was facing criminal charges and the IRS had frozen his offshore accounts, the money he'd stolen from employees wasn't going to be returned anytime soon. The legal process would take years, and in the meantime, the company was crumbling. What I hadn't anticipated was how much his collapse would affect the rest of us. Jackson and Company's clients were leaving in droves, and the board of directors, desperate to salvage what they could, announced massive layoffs. Entire departments were gutted. On a chilly Friday morning, I received an email informing me that my position had been terminated, effective immediately. There was no severance, just a cold, corporate apology for the unfortunate circumstances. I wasn't surprised, but it still stung. After everything I'd done, I was being discarded like everyone else. Lisa called me later that day, furious. "Can you believe this? They're letting us all go, but Richard's probably still sitting in some penthouse with his high-priced lawyers." "It doesn't matter," I said, trying to sound stronger than I felt. "He'll get what's coming to him." But even as I said it, doubt crept in. People like Richard had a way of escaping justice. He was out on bail now, and rumors swirled that he was negotiating a plea deal. The thought made me sick, but there was nothing I could do. I'd done my part, and now I had to pick up the pieces of my own life. With no job and dwindling savings, I threw myself into finding work, but the job market wasn't kind. The scandal at Jackson and Company had tarnished my resume. Potential employers saw my experience there as a red flag. Weeks turned into months, and my bank account inched closer to zero. Meanwhile, my mom's surgery date approached, and I still didn't have enough to cover the remaining costs. I'd hoped the lawsuit against Richard would move quickly, but it was tied up in endless legal red tape. One night, sitting in the dim light of my kitchen, I stared at the overdue medical bills piled on the table. I had done everything right. I had fought back, exposed the corruption, and tried to make things better, not just for me, but for everyone Richard had hurt. And yet, here I was, worse off than before. The weight of it all pressed down on me until I could barely breathe. A call from Lisa snapped me out of my spiral. "Ellie, turn on the news," she said, her voice trembling. "What's going on?" I asked, reaching for the remote. "It's Richard." I flipped to the local news station, and there it was, disgraced CEO Richard Jackson found dead in apparent suicide. The anchor's voice was steady, but the details were chilling. Richard had been found in his penthouse that morning, a bottle of whiskey and a handwritten note on the table beside him. The note was brief, apologizing to his family for the shame he had brought them but making no mention of the people he'd stolen from. The reporter speculated that the mounting lawsuits and the threat of prison had pushed him over the edge. For a moment, I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no anger, just a hollow emptiness. I thought I'd feel vindicated knowing he couldn't escape justice, but this didn't feel like justice. It felt unfinished. He was gone, but the damage he'd done remained. The money he'd stolen was still missing, locked up in legal battles that might never be resolved. The people he'd hurt, including me, were still struggling to rebuild their lives. Lisa called again later that night. "I don't know how to feel," she admitted. "I hated him, but I never wanted this." "Neither did I," said quietly. After we hung up, I sat in silence, staring out the window. Richard's death dominated the news for days, sparking endless debates about corporate greed, accountability, and mental health. But for me, it wasn't just a headline. It was the end of a fight I had poured my heart into, and it left me feeling more lost than ever. A week later, my mom's surgery was cancelled. Without the remaining payment, the hospital wouldn't proceed, no matter how much I begged and pleaded. She tried to reassure me, saying we'd figure something out, but I could see the resignation in her eyes. She was getting worse, and time was running out. One evening, I sat by her bedside, holding her hand as she drifted in and out of sleep. The beeping of the machines was the only sound in the room. I thought about everything I'd done, every risk I'd taken to expose Richard. I'd wanted to make things right, to give her the life she deserved. But now, all I felt was regret. "Ellie," she murmured, her voice weak. Her eyes fluttered open, and she gave me a faint smile. "You did your best. That's all that matters." Her words broke something in me. Tears streamed down my face as I clung to her hand, wishing I could go back and do it all differently. I'd fought so hard for justice, but in the end, it had cost me everything. A month later, my mom passed away. I sat alone at her funeral, the bitter winter wind cutting through my coat. Lisa came, as did a few of my old co-workers, but the ceremony was small. I couldn't afford anything more. Afterward, I returned to my empty apartment, the silence pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't lift. The world had moved on from Richard Jackson's story, but I couldn't escape it. The man who had taken so much from me was gone, but his legacy of destruction remained. As I sat in the darkness, I realized that revenge wasn't the triumph I thought it would be. Justice had come, but it hadn't saved me. It hadn't saved my mom. In the end, I was left with nothing but the hollow satisfaction of knowing I had tried, and the crushing truth that sometimes, trying isn't enough.